You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast, and on this episode, we're playing everyone's favorite game show, Final Cut. Here we go.
Recorded in front of a live studio audience.
You're listening to the Fan2Fan Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Bernie Gonzalez. With me, as always, fellow co-host Pete Charbonneau. And Pete, I'm in a playful mood. It's also spooky season, so let's combine the two and throw out maybe some game show type episodes that we can release that might be entertaining for listeners. And honestly, let's not forget our studio audience. Welcome to your favorite and everyone's favorite game show. The Fan2Fan Podcast presents Final Cut, a horror movie trivia focused on alternate casting. Are you ready, Pete Charbonneau?
My only regret is that one of my all-time favorite game show hosts, Wink Martindale, R.I.P., is not alive. I'd say to see it, but most people are going to probably just hear this, so I regret that he's not going to hear it, at least not on this earthly plane, somewhere out there in the ether. Hopefully Wink's winking.
And he's a perfect example about how some good shows really just need that good host to kind of make things happen. They're the engine that kind of keeps the show going and gives it personality. I think you could say that's also important to movies because that's how important casting is. Let's start off with two examples, Pete. This is just to give everyone a sense if this is their first time checking out the Fan2Fan Podcast presents Final Cut. It's 1972. The Godfather is released. Michael Corleone, a pivotal character in the Godfather movies. The studio's choice, Paramount initially pushed hard to get Robert Redford, Ryan O'Neal, or even Warren Beatty as Michael Corleone.
Oh my goodness.
But the director, Francis Ford Coppola, really insisted on Al Pacino, who was then relatively an unknown stage actor, and I think we can all agree Pacino's performance is iconic, and his portrayal of this sort of anti-hero allows Coppola to really make Godfather what it's become, and obviously its sequels, and become a part of pop culture in cinema history.
I'll take the slings and arrows because I have still never seen any of the Godfather pictures.
Oh my goodness.
Ouch. Okay, all right. Well, here, I'll give you another example for another trilogy you probably have seen, which is Back to the Future. All right, Marty McFly, Back to the Future 1985, Eric Stoltz was cast. They actually filmed for a few weeks, but director Robert Zemeckis and producer Spielberg realized Stoltz was just a little too serious for what they wanted. They recast. Michael J. Fox comes in. He was balancing his work on TV's Family Ties, and obviously his energy makes Marty McFly a pop culture icon. Those movies would not have been what they have become without those two actors. We're going to do the same with horror trivia, Pete. And we're going to start taking a walk down Elm Street.
The kids of Elm Street don't know it yet, but something is coming to get them. Nightmare on Elm Street. No! No! She's the only one who can stop it. If she fails, no one will survive.
Help me, please!
Wes Craven's Nightmare on Elm Street, rated R.
Putting to our friend Freddy, he says every town has an Elm Street, so hopefully this won't be too much of a nightmare for you.
Has he ever been fact-checked on that? Have we run the numbers on every town in America?
This game show doesn't have that level of funding, Pete.
Okay.
We don't have that.
Right.
Yeah, we don't have the fact-checking abilities for that. No, sorry.
Fair enough.
But we do have funding for questions, starting with question number 1 for you, Pete. The role of Freddy Krueger in A Nightmare on Elm Street, we released in 1984, was famously played by Robert Englund, but as we know, I mean, that's the whole point of the show, he wasn't the first choice for the role. There were alternate casting considerations, Pete. I'm going to give you a few options. One of these is an actual alternate casting consideration for Freddy.
All right.
The others are not. But I made them specifically a little tricky because I wanted to get some actors, veterans, some might say, at that era that would make sense. All right. Alternate casting considerations for Freddy Krueger. First of all, Lance Henriksen, Terminator, Aliens. Michael Ironside, who at the time that Nightmare on Elm Street came out in 1984, was popular for Scanners and Visiting Hours. David Warner, who at the time had been in The Omen and Time Bandits. And last but not least, Klaus Kinski, who had made Nosferatu the Vampire and Fitzcarraldo. Which one of these was a consideration for Freddy Krueger?
All right, so this is 83. I'm going with Kinski. It's just enough out there that I almost want to see it now.
That is a great choice, Pete. It's also, unfortunately, the wrong choice.
Do I at least win a copy, a home version of the game?
You do not, because we don't have the money for that. Again, we don't have the funds. So 1984, Nightmare on Elm Street is released, but in 1983, when it was in production, you had director Wes Craven, who originally considered veteran actor David Warner, who at the time, again, was known for The Omen and Time Bandits, for the role of Freddy Krueger. Warner was cast, and going back to our Google image search, actually did some early makeup tests, and you can actually find, it kind of blows you away. You can actually see how far they got along with the makeup test for David Warner as Freddy. Unfortunately, he had to drop out due to scheduling conflicts, and that opened up the door for England to take on the part. But David Warner, who recently, just a few days ago, Pete, rest in peace, he passed away.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I did hear about that. He is one of those guys that he would just pop up in so many different things in the 80s. I mean, Time Bandits I absolutely love. Like, his performance as Evil, and that is great. This is great because I had never heard of that fact that he was up for Freddy Krueger, and not only up for it, but had been cast. So this is pretty wild to me.
Again, like Marco Corleone in Godfather or Marty McFly in Back to the Future, you just wonder where the character Freddy would have gone, because whenever I think of David Warner, I think of him as more of a serious actor, almost more aristocratic, maybe even. Like you see him playing the government agent. He had that role down pat in Titanic, where he played the butler henchman type character. And then would he have brought that sort of zaniness, almost that like Looney Tunes quality that Robert Englund eventually brought to Freddy Krueger? Who's to say?
Well, that's what I was just thinking about. Like, I imagine there's another world where he only does the first one, and then maybe for various reasons doesn't want to be tied into, a series of sequels, or doesn't like the direction where they kind of push Freddy into being more of a wisecracking force, and so maybe Robert Englund steps in part 2, or maybe someone else, who knows. But yeah, it's certainly interesting to think about how he would have tackled that role. Yeah, I'm trying to think, the original Nightmare on Elm Street, although there's some lines, it's mostly like Freddy is mostly played as like a malevolent force, as opposed to, the jokes all kind of came later.
We don't get a lot of the tongue-in-cheek line ends with bitch until much later in the Freddy sequels. But it's funny you said that, because I think it was in part 3 or 4 that the producers, in order to save some money, they didn't want to pay Robert Englund his fee. And they just thought, well, we can just put anyone under the mask. And I guess after just a few days of shooting, they quickly realized you cannot just put anyone under the mask. Robert Englund defined that character. I'd like to think David Warner would have brought something to it. Maybe just would not have been the Nightmare on Elm Street that we know today.
Yeah, that's very true. Like, I'm struggling to remember much of any of the remake that they did. And, Jackie Earle Haley is a great actor. But even he's like, that was just such a bomb, and just kind of drove home the point of like how some of these remakes are just, they're just the cash grab, and they're not really bringing anything new to the table. So even if you have someone that is capable, under the makeup, does it really make a difference? It's like, if a dream falls in the woods and no one's there to not wake up and get slashed by Freddy, did it really happen?
Queen said it best, when it comes to many things, just like casting, it's a kind of magic. All right, let's move on to a hotel, Pete, that I think you're familiar with, the Overlook Hotel. This is the hotel featured in the 1980 classic
The Shining, a masterpiece of modern horror, directed by Stanley Kubrick, starring Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall, rated R, opens Friday.
And we're talking about Jack Torrance. So obviously the role of Jack Torrance was made famous by Jack Nicholson, but the whole point of this show is that several other actors were considered. So again, I'm going to throw you some alternate casting considerations. One of them is true. The other ones are blatant lies that I made to feel like they are potentially true, because my whole point is to try to fool you, Pete. Ready for the fooling to begin?
I'm nothing if not a fool to be fooled.
There you go. Let's rush in. All right. So our first choice, Roy Schneider, Brody and Jaws, and all that jazz. Robin Williams of Mork and Mindy, Nanu Nanu, and also Popeye.
Oh.
Elliot Gould of MASH and The Long Goodbye, sort of neo-noir movie. James Caan, who at the time had been in, obviously, The Godfather and Rollerball. Roy Schneider, Robin Williams, Elliot Gould, James Caan. Instead of Jack Nicholson, which one of these actors, Pete, might have been Jack Torrance?
So immediately, Robin Williams, you can see playing the crazed Jack Torrance for sure. At that point, though, not known for his serious acting ability.
I mean, outside of Good Will Hunting, he was also in a movie ironically called The Final Cut. Very serious for him. But yeah, at that point, he was not known for any of that. He was known for Nanu Nanu and zaniness, and probably headlining at Zanies.
Roy Scheider, I could see kind of doing like the brooding part, but like when he snaps, I don't know. I mean, great actor. I'm not seeing it. My gut is bringing me to Jimmy Caan. I feel like that would have been the type of actor that they would have looked to cast in something like that.
That is a really good choice, Pete. Again, unfortunately, an incorrect choice. Of all of them, it was actually Robin Williams that was considered by the studio. Kubrick rejected him for the reasons that, well, we maybe saw at the time. He was, quote, too psychotic and did not think he would be a good fit for the role of Jack Torrance. Ultimately, Jack Nicholson was cast, but other people who were considered, Pete, John Voight, who at the time had made Deliverance and Midnight Cowboy, Gene Hackman, who at the time had made French Connection, The Conversation, Robert De Niro, Taxi Driver and Raging Bull, and Harrison Ford, who at the time had already released Star Wars. An interesting number of really, obviously well-known actors, iconic actors, but to your point, you're Kubrick, and he's obviously well-known for making cinema and being very mindful and intellectual in his choices. I'm sure that probably went into casting. I don't see a lot of these people that could have pulled that transformation that Jack Nicholson did that's so legendary. Yeah, just don't see it with a Harrison Ford or a John Voight. But hey, a lot of these actors, that's the whole point. They did amazing jobs in their careers. That's why we know their work.
Absolutely. Yeah, I also feel that had Robin Williams been cast, he might have hoovered up so much cocaine that they would not have had any left in the budget to make the snow at the Overlook for those model shots.
That's right. Let's move on to a place that you're familiar with, Pete, Washington, D.C. And you've been to these infamous steps, the Exorcist steps that were featured in 1973's The Exorcist.
Nobody expected it.
All right, now Reagan, let's go.
Nobody believed it. And nothing could stop it. The one hope. The only hope returns. The Exorcist, rated R.
Of the many roles in that movie that are legendary, we're going to talk about Father Merrin, and the role of Father Merrin ultimately went to Max von Sydow, but other legendary actors were considered. Some of those actors, one of these which was actually one of them, first Marlon Brando, who at the time had already been in Streetcar Named Desire and The Godfather, Richard Burton, who was in The Robe and Beckett, Laurence Olivier, who was in Hamlet and The Boys from Brazil, and Gregory Peck, who had been in To Kill a Mockingbird and The Omen. So one of these actors, Brando, Burton, Olivier, or Peck, was actually considered for Father Merrin before Max von Sydow wore the collar.
Well, and Burton was in famously or infamously Exorcist 2, The Heretic, often considered one of the worst movies and sequels ever made. This is tough. You know, I have to say, I'm currently reading a great book on The Exorcist called The Exorcist Legacy that goes into really good detail about the making of The Exorcist and its sequels. And I'm trying to remember if they mentioned who was up for the role of Father Merrin in it, because none of those names jump out at me. I thought I had the inside track on this one. I'm like, well, I got this one nailed. And turns out I, in fact, do not have it nailed. In fact, I'm not even holding a hammer. It's interesting. I mean, yeah, they do talk about, like, William Peter Blatty and Friedkin going back and forth on the script and the changes that were made from the book, and there was a whole lot of drama around it, but also a whole lot of camaraderie between the two of them. They had an interesting relationship.
Probably enough where they were aware how important this role would be. The whole movie, right, kind of lays on the foundation that this girl next door is essentially literally possessed by something otherworldly. So Friedkin was smart enough to realize, I need to cast an actress who can pull this off. I need to cast a mother, an actress in the role of the mother that can make every mother feel like they are on the screen being protective and worried about their daughter. And then you'd have to have this character in Max von Sydow who would be equal parts ominous, but at the same time, a potential salvation to a woman who's literally, possessed by a demon. When you think about Brando, Burton, Olivier, Peck, there's a lot of good options here. You think of Peck in The Omen, that's up there in like the prestige horror of the 70s with like Rosemary's Baby. So any of them could have been a good casting decision, but Pete, only one of them was.
Well, I do know, as a quick aside, that the part of Reagan's mother was written, essentially, it was written after Shirley MacLaine. That's who it's based on. And they wanted Shirley MacLaine to play it, and she did not want to do it. So I can give you that. Yeah. It's interesting, too, because Max von Sydow at the time was, I think he'd been in a couple of things like you mentioned, but he was not really a well-known quantity. So the fact that he landed that role was a bit of a coup. I really have no clue on this one, so I'm going to guess that it was Burton who got his chance on the second go round to get into the franchise, but that would just be my guess.
The guess that I would have made, but since I actually can see the right answer, I wouldn't pick it because that would be the wrong answer. The actual suggestion from Warner Brothers was Marlon Brando to play the role of Father Merrin, but William Friedkin refused, fearing it would become too much of a, quote, Brando movie, which makes sense because some of these actors, and I mean this not as a negative, they take up so much of the oxygen in the room, on the stage, on the screen, that the audience can't help but move their attention towards them. So I could see in what is in some ways this very understated role, but at the same time comes in literally in the third act. Well, now I'm going to not only believe in what's happening here, I'm going to potentially be the hope for your daughter. Max von Sydow was doing a lot of work there, and he accomplished it.
Yeah, and just from what I've been reading in this book, which is great, just knowing the way that Friedkin directed them, because he was coming off of an Oscar performance, and the way that he kind of, I feel like if he and Brando were on the set together, one of them might not have made it out. Like just hearing about some of the stories that like he had, I don't know, I don't think it was loaded. I think it was loaded with blanks, but like to get performances out of the actors, he had a gun that he would fire to like just give them like jolts. And in the climactic scene at the end of The Exorcist, spoiler alert, when Father Karras jumps out the window and is dying, and like Father Dyer is giving him the last rites, he wasn't getting the performance out of him. So he's like, listen, he's like, do you trust what Friedkin said to the actor playing Father Dyer? He's like, do you trust me? And he's like, yes. And he slugged him in the face right then and there. And then his reaction, like the tears started flowing. He's like, okay, roll it. And that's how he got the performance. Like, I mean, this is like early 70s and this is like the auteur director shit. But like, can you imagine that happening now?
You can't now. No, you'd have social media filled with stories. Like, I don't know. I'm not as well studied in like that era of cinema, but I think there is sort of like a, what do they call it? Like cinema verite. Like there's a lot of things in that era from those new wave of directors. You know, for every Spielberg that seems to like dip into nostalgia, you get people like Kubrick and Coppola, Friedkin with movies like Apocalypse Now and The Shining that feel very real, and some of them just happen to have it almost feels at times like a documentary.
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, yeah, that it definitely sounds like that was Friedkin, at least early in his career. He was all about like the verite documentary style filmmaking, and all of that is, again, just to sum up, like I can't picture Brando being on set with Friedkin pulling some of those shenanigans and that just kind of being okay.
I also wonder if he would pull a Superman and say, well, I don't have time to film here with this young Linda Blair. Can you replace her with a bagel and I'll just act to that?
Brando gives a hungry performance as Father Merrin.
All right, Pete. So from a number of legendary directors that we kind of mentioned, let's go to another one. Alfred Hitchcock, who directed 1960s Psycho.
Here we have a quiet little motel. This motel also has, as an adjunct, an old house. That was the top of these stairs that the second murder took place. Here's the woman's room. This picture has great significance. The shower was on, there was no sound. And,
And Psycho is nothing without its leading man, the defining role played by Anthony Perkins of Norman Bates. But, as is the point of this whole show, he wasn't the only actor considered for the role. There were alternate casting considerations, Pete. I'm going to name you 4. Only one of them is true. First one, Christopher Walken, who at the time had only been in Me and My Brother. Martin Sheen, who had been in a movie called The Incident. Robert Redford, who'd been in Inside Daisy Clover at the time. Or Tony Curtis, Sweet Smell of Success. Only one of them could have landed the role of Norman Bates.
Man, I feel like I am, at this point, this is when the host is like, well, thanks for playing our game. We have some wonderful parting gifts for you. Let me pull the Oprah here, but, you know, it won't be for lack of trying.
Some say you would go psycho trying to find the right answer.
Oh, boy. If only my mother could see me now. Boy, I'm trying to think back to the time, the era. I feel like any of them probably could have done the role.
And you think they're all young actors. When I think of a young Walken,
right?
Martin Sheen, I think of The Dead Zone with Stephen King. So, I mean, they're not completely alien to like the genre world. And, you know, when you think about Psycho, I kind of put it in that sort of proto slasher world with another movie that's forgotten that came out the same year called Peeping Tom. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of the movie that set up the blueprint that sets up the, here we go, Pete, John Carpenter's 1978 Halloween. That makes the slasher explosion we all grew up with. But you take that all the way back to Psycho, Anthony Perkins. If it wasn't for what he did with Norman Bates, we probably would not have gotten a memorable Hitchcock movie. But Walken, Sheen, Redford, and Tony Curtis were all considered.
I'm trying to think, were any of them blonde? Because I know Hitchcock had a thing for blondes. I think the closest probably would be Redford, but he's a ginger, isn't he?
I literally have in my notes here, do not reveal hair color.
Okay. Can I buy a vowel? Is that, am I playing the right game right now? I don't know. Hashtag Tony Curtis. That's my guess.
Tony Curtis is not again, an option, Pete. Of the options that I gave you, Pete, Martin Sheen was actually considered for the role of Norman Bates in Psycho. Hitchcock ultimately chose, obviously, Anthony Perkins, but during the casting, I guess, reportedly, Martin Sheen was on the short list of actors that that Hitchcock was considering for the role of Norman Bates, which is interesting because I think Martin Sheen has a lot of range. But again, there's something about Anthony Perkins and the way he kind of plays, dutiful to his mother. And then when we find out, the secrets behind where all that comes from, there's a constrained madness. I think that's probably the best way I can describe it to how he plays it. Because I think, again, just like in The Exorcist, you have to believe that this girl is just the girl that's next door, just like you have to believe Norman Bates is just the nice guy who's making you a sandwich in the middle of a rainstorm and maybe providing you with lodging before you find out that things get a little psycho.
It's interesting because, like, his look is so iconic. He's got, like, this lankiness to him, which I was immediately like, I'm like, well, Walken maybe at that age, like, might have been, like, if Hitchcock was looking for a certain body type, like, that might have matched up. The others probably would not have. But it's always fascinating. It's fun to play these type of games of, like, the what ifs. And when we find out, like, any movie that we watch, when we hear of certain names that were kind of in the mix and in the running of what a different movie, some of these would have been with a different actor or actress in them.
It's a good point you brought that up too about his stature, like his build, because I've heard some people say, people way smarter than me that kind of picked up on this, that he does have sort of like a leaning posture to him that kind of makes him look a little bit maybe bird-like, maybe vulture, turkey-like. And obviously, with his bird stuffing, his animal stuffing hobby that he has, that's the genius in some of these directors like Hitchcock, where they see that into casting and they hope that maybe unspoken energy shows up on the screen, and that maybe the audience's brain is making all these sort of like unconscious connections, that his neck, the way he cranes his back or his posture make you feel like he could be a bird of prey, that he could be threatening. But it's just all of these things that could sound like horseshit. But I think, when we see Vince Vaughn that's cast in like the remake, obviously they were going for a similar build in the Norman Bates recasting of that role, but there was something there to begin with that obviously spoke to audiences that made Norman Bates so memorable.
Yeah, I think there's something about that. 'Cause I think when a lot of people think of like physicality in a role, they think of like strength and like bulkiness, but like physicality could just be how you position your body. Like I haven't seen Psycho in a while, so I'm not recalling with great clarity, but I almost feel like the way, like you were saying, the way he stands sometimes, like the angles are almost like off. It's almost like German expressionism of a human being in some respect.
Well, I'm going to give you a shot at redemption for what is going to be the last question in this installment of Final Cut. But we are going to go back to the Bates Motel with Psycho 2.
The mystery continues. At a theater near you.
1983, Norman Bates returns 23 years after playing Norman Bates and making him legendary in the original Psycho. Anthony Perkins comes back. He reprises the role of Norman Bates, but at the time, producers, as they are wont to do, had to have another acting ace in their back pocket in the event that Anthony Perkins did not want to reprise his role. So they looked at a number of different actors for what would be Psycho 2, a movie that I think you and I have kind of discussed in passing, never for the podcast, but we've kind of talked about how literally the Psycho movies, the sequels, are actually way better than you would think they have any business having, for what I think some of them become just like Showtime or cable exclusive movies at some point. But alternate casting considerations for Norman Bates in Psycho 2 from 1983, Pete. So I'm going to give you also a few movies that these actors would have been famous for around that time. Starting with John Lithgow, who was in Blowout and The World According to Garp, William Hurt, Altered States and Body Heat, James Woods, Videodrome and Cat's Eye, and Donald Sutherland in Don't Look Now and Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So you have to remember, Norman Bates is a little older, 23 years, maybe not exactly, in screen years. So maybe they kind of fudged the numbers. He's not necessarily 23 years older on screen, but I think the audience would agree. Yeah, we're looking at an older Norman Bates, potentially played by a Lithgow, William Hurt, James Woods, or Donald Sutherland. Producers are thinking Anthony Perkins, he's too busy. He's got a cruise booked. He's not going to be able to come in for filming Psycho 2. Which one of these was actually considered, Pete?
Perkins in the Pacific. The Tony Perkins cruise experience.
That's right.
And this is another one. I can picture all of these actors portraying an older Norman Bates. So, all right. Well, this is going to be another shot in the dark. And, based on my track record so far, it's going to be a blank. But not a gross point one. Damn it.
Lithgow, Hurt, Woods, or Sutherland?
I'm gonna go Lithgow just because I have his crazed visage from the Twilight Zone movie in my brain, and obviously Norman Bates is not crazed like that, but I feel like Lithgow can he can pull and kind of exhibit that without looking as manic. Maybe. I don't know. At this point, I don't know what I'm talking about. I've had several bottles of wine.
Well, Pete, you are 0 for 4, and now you are 1 for 5. 1 for 5. Lithgow's name was indeed circulated and considered to be the most prominent person to take on the role of Norman Bates if Anthony Perkins had declined, but Perkins returned to the role. 100% agree. I think of that group, I can see James Woods being a bit creepy, but I think his level of creep Pete is a little bit too much on the surface versus someone like Lithgow, who I think has played, more of the sane neighbor that could have moments of craze and madness. And I think that's what Norman Bates is, someone who on face value seems completely normal, and then because of circumstances or triggers goes psycho.
Yes, you can see Lithgow, he can do that like low-key charm, and he can also ramp it up to 11, but then he can also give you like cliffhanger, right? Like, again, I haven't seen that movie in ages, but I don't think he was like super over the top all the time. I felt like he was kind of like bad guy in control, so like you could see him inhabiting Norman Bates.
Yes.
And older Norman Bates, for sure.
Absolutely. All right, Pete, if I did my job, I think I threw enough curveballs at you to make this a little bit difficult for you.
Unlike Pedro Serrano up here just flailing away.
Well, for folks, hopefully, that were listening, assuming they just didn't go ahead and cheat and start looking up the answers, it was entertaining for them. And that is the first installment of Final Cut. But we'll be back for our second installment of Final Cut, where, a spoiler alert, we may be going into the world of Carpenter.
Final Cut, a Mark Goodson, Bill Todman production.